So I'd like to thank Alyssa for inviting me. This is a really great opportunity to talk to a group that's very much involved in creating the product about which I get to write and have so much fun. This is also something of a high pressure audience, so I hope I will be providing the type of information you're interested in. I'm going to focus on some of the things I've been looking at, but I would be happy to entertain questions at the end. And if I don't have the answers, I will perhaps have some insight on where else they could be found or who else might be a good source for that. So I think the only group that was higher pressure was when I spoke to the centennial anniversary gathering of the Masters Brewers Association of the Upper Midwest about a month after my Minnesota book came out. And they were asking me to sign copies of my book. I should have had them signing copies of my book. Without them, there was nothing. So I'd like to talk a little bit about where I got the interest in the research and how I went about it, and then move on to some of the things that seem like they would be most relevant for this group. So I think, even though I didn't realize it yet, my first interest in researching beer came from this ad that I saw when I was researching something totally different about US interest in World War I as it broke out in 1914. And this ad happened to be near one of the articles I was looking at. And I remember thinking that, this was kind of an interesting way to advertise beer. There aren't any people running around in bathing suits on a beach. They're actually talking about the quality of the beer. And this stayed in the back of my mind for quite a while. And what really triggered my full interest was when I was working on part of my master's paper about the Northern Pacific Railroad as it was going through northern Minnesota and about decisions it was making about where to put the line. I came across this ad for breweries in an old Moorhead, Minnesota newspaper. And at the time, I didn't realize there had been a brewery up in Moorhead. Essentially, all I knew about in Minnesota were the big three of Schmidt and Hams and Grain Belt, and I was aware of Shells and Cold Spring. That was pretty much all I knew about historically. So who knew that Moorhead had a brewery? Well, my question went, well, okay, who does know? I started to look around to see if I could find out anything about it. There really wasn't. And I just kind of casually mentioned to some friends that someday maybe I'll write a book about this. And then they kept asking me how my book was coming. So I was luckily able to get connected with the University of Minnesota Press, but then the real work started. Now, while I have this image up here, this was a little bit of a spoiler for the next book, because I was at the time focused on Erickson's brewery in Moorhead, but also noticed that the Philip Best's Bohemian beer was also available in the Dakota Territory as it was then, and I had never heard of Philip Best's beer. I should have been paying a lot more attention, because the brewery, of course, would be much better known under Philip Best's son-in-law's name, Fred Pabst. So in a way, I was learning more about my next project as well. I ended up going to many of the great research libraries of the country, a couple of different libraries of Congress, National Archives depositories, the Harvard Business School Library, and a few other buildings that just weren't as photogenic, so they don't get in here. Spent a lot of time in primary sources. The industry directories, while not necessarily up to date, provided a lot of information that would be of interest to people in the industry. Did these breweries do their own malting, which we will return to later? Did they bottle their beer? What type of beer, in fact, did they make? I spent a lot of time in the industry journals, and things like the American Brewers Review, for me, were something of a Rosetta Stone, because they were published parallel English and German, and my German is adequate when I have a lot of time to slow down and read it. It is not adequate when I'm trying to have a quick conversation on the streets in Munich or something. So this was a big help to me. But again, it gave me a lot of in-depth information well beyond simply when did a brewery open, when did it close. The state government had a lot of good research, especially in Wisconsin so far, regular inspections of the building, which gave incredible details about the employees, about what types of building they had, how many times it was inspected, and what flaws they found. I spent a lot of time in excise tax records, and this gave me really good production details because the government wanted to make absolutely sure that they got the right amount of money. Also spent time with census records. And some of the most fun, though, was actually being able to work with collectors and seeing some of the artifacts they had, like this malt shovel, which we believe was probably used prior to Prohibition by the Akanto Brewing Company in Wisconsin. So all of this work first led to, in 2007, the publication of Land of Amber Waters, and then almost exactly a year ago, The Drink That Made Wisconsin Famous, for which the book tour this summer was sadly interrupted. So what I'd like to do here is give a little bit of background information about the brewing industry in these two states and the other two that I've started to look at, Iowa and Michigan, for just a little bit of a baseline. And then I'd like to look at some of the more specific details about how brewers, farmers, maltsters, and other businesses interacted. So we'll start with Wisconsin. And there will not be a quiz on this, at least not one that you can't go back and refer to the video for. But the first brewery was established in 1835, so 13 years before it was a state. And Wisconsin's brewing industry grew very quickly. They were over 150 by 1860, probably around 200 by 1872. And for some of these numbers, I'm saying about because there are times when the numbers that we got from the government, from professional organizations, disagreed on how many breweries were open. So all of these states will start and have a quick rise. They will plateau. They will drop down again. Wisconsin will have much less of a drop than most other states. They'll have quite a few still open before Prohibition. About 90 will return after Prohibition. The consolidation will strike Wisconsin, though, like it will everywhere else, just not quite as severely. By 1980, the low point, they will be down to 8 breweries. Wisconsin was a fascinating sample of a state that had national giants, especially by the 1970s and 80s, a few smaller small-town breweries, and very little in between. So in Wisconsin, the craft era started in 1985, both with Hibernia in Eau Claire and Sprecher in Milwaukee. There's currently about 225 breweries in Wisconsin, subject to anybody that has closed recently due to the economic downturn. And I apologize for the XX there. In 1882, which is the year for which I have the best comparison statistics, about 60 to 65% of Wisconsin's breweries had their own malting facilities. In Minnesota, first brewery, not quite a decade before statehood, and they grew very quickly as well. Their high point was a little over 120 by 1872. Contraction hit, and only about 2 dozen returned after Prohibition. And Minnesota was really hurt by contraction, and by 1980, there were only 4 breweries in the state. For Minnesota, most people immediately think of Hams. That's the national. Grain Belt and Schmidt were big regionals, and a few small town breweries, one of which is still extremely important today, the August Shell Brewery in New Ulm. The craft era around here started in 1986. There's about 200 breweries in the state right now. And again, in 1882, about 60 to 65% had their own maltings. I've just started work on Michigan, and this is going to be a different state for some of this early analysis because their first brewery was in 1706. And I believe that is the first commercial brewery west of the Appalachians. I still have a little bit more work to do about that. So by 1872, Detroit, I think, or Michigan had peaked a little bit earlier, and they were a little different because more of their breweries were concentrated in Detroit than Wisconsin's breweries were concentrated in Milwaukee. Throughout history, there have actually been more different breweries in Detroit than in Milwaukee. Fewer returned after Prohibition, and they were down to, I think, 4 as well by 1980, though I have to do a little bit more crunching of the numbers. For Michigan, the story was Stroh's and a few small town breweries, but where Michigan really stands out is the craft brewing era, where they got started a few years earlier than anybody else with the Chelsea Real Ale Company. And more than half of the breweries that have ever operated in Michigan have been in the craft brew era. They currently have about 350 there, so far ahead of any of the other states in the upper Midwest. Now, in 1882, only about a third of the Michigan breweries had their own maltings. And I think that that is probably because Michigan's industry had matured more, and some of them were in landlocked areas where they didn't have room to continue to operate their own malting. And I think also because the barley crop had generally moved to the west to the other states I'm covering. And then there's Iowa, where they got a relatively late start compared to statehood. Once again, they also grew quickly, but Iowa went through state prohibition 4 times before national prohibition took hold. Only a very few returned after prohibition, and they were down to 1 operating brewery in the state by 1980. And just looking at the map, I think we learn a fair amount about it. They were crushed by their neighboring states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Missouri. The vast majority of beer production is on their border. They had a good start along the river valley. There was also a lot more ale brewing in Iowa than I would have expected. Their craft area likewise started in 1985, but it was a lot slower to take off there, and they're only up to about 85 right now. But also, like Minnesota and Wisconsin, about 2/3 almost had their own maltings. So our focus today, of course, is going to be on the grain. And as was mentioned earlier, we really sit right in the middle of the great barley growing region. This was a map that RAR Malting put out in 1952 as part of a promotional book. And it, of course, includes their main facilities as well. But it gives you some idea of the reach and some of the varieties that were available at the time. It was a fairly oversimplified list, but I think to a certain degree in the 1950s, barley farming and malting was a fairly simple thing. There were not as many varieties of grain being actively marketed for the brewing industry. So we are right in the heart of the grain belt, and this label should look familiar because it's what my publishers used as the basis for the Land of Amber Waters. And the Grain Belt Brewing Company wasn't actually called that until the very late 1960s. It was simply their flagship beer, but grain was such an important component of the identity of Minnesota and the beer as well that everyone called it the Grain Belt Brewery, even when it was the Minneapolis Brewing Company. We're going to start a little bit here through this transition to showing some images of grain on the labels, which was in many cases one of the most important types of visual advertising. Sometimes it would just be a very simple image of a sheaf of grain. In many cases, these are not going to be particularly accurate depictions of 2-row or 6-row barley, but it got the grain idea across. And in this particular case, this was a beer that was made for the Dakota markets because both North and South Dakota became states with prohibition written into their state constitutions. So many of the labels emphasized the idea of grain and its importance to the beer. The Farmers Brewing Company in Shawano was one of many who traded on this important identification. And we see the planting on the left and the harvesting on the right in one of the great triptych style labels of the period right before World War I began. Other breweries made similar claims, and the Würzer beer from Peoples was again focusing almost entirely on the grain. And the reason it's overprinted American was this was a label they had been using for some time, but as World War II was approaching, they thought it would be beneficial to make absolutely clear that this was not a German product, that it was an American beer. Sometimes the grain on the label would be a bit more stylized, like the Art Deco version we have here from Boscobel in about 1934. So grain shows up on a lot of different labels, a lot of different advertising, and even occasionally used to show up on TV ads with a field of waving barley, again, before it was replaced by groups of young people having fun. So now to some of the more specific things. Back in the pre-World War, in fact, pre-Civil War period especially, most brewers got their barley directly from the farmer. So going as far back as the 1760s on the East Coast, and as far back as we had breweries and newspapers in the upper Midwest, we would see advertisements like this. And this is essentially the standard that most of them went by. They were going to, whoever they were going to pay the highest market price in cash, whatever the quantity of barley, and bring it to the brewery. There would be occasional situations where they would actually advertise the price, or at one point, the Rar Brewery in Manitowoc, later more famous for its maltings, actually laid out the 3 payment terms in very high levels of specifics for the local farmers. I have found ads in German newspapers with this similar message. I have found them in Dutch newspapers with this message. And in one of the Michigan newspapers, I found a bilingual ad in 1827 for French and English if you brought the barley to the front of the mansion house for Ullman and Company's brewery. So an 1827 ad. And as a history geek and a history teacher for the day job, it gave me some pause to realize that I'm looking at a newspaper here that was printed when John Quincy Adams was president, the 6th president. So it's kind of impressive that some of this stuff even exists still. The breweries were very important to the local community. This ad from John Abbott in Detroit, even a couple of years earlier, simply announced that his brewery had burned on and therefore he wasn't buying any barley at the moment. But he wanted to remind the farmers to keep growing it because once they rebuild, they will be buying huge quantities of it. So please don't switch to some other crop. We're going to need you. One of the most interesting things I found recently, and I haven't seen anything like this elsewhere, is this picture of the Zelt Brewery in Washington, Pennsylvania, just south of Pittsburgh, where an advertisement proclaiming cash for barley was painted right on the brewery. And it pixelated a little bit. I was not able to get a higher quality image. But again, I haven't seen anything like this before, and it's fascinating that they were choosing to advertise in this way. I can only speculate that this brewery must have been right on one of the main roads, and therefore this would have been seen by passing farmers. Another one from Detroit, this time from Owen, who is taking over the brewery at the Mansion House. And this one seems to indicate that he was doing malting for other people who did not have the facilities that needed malting done. And we can see that in the little bit right next to the pointing finger at the bottom. Malting will be done on reasonable terms, yeast and grain available to customers at the customary prices. And we'll have a little bit more about grains in just a second. So we can see from the many pictures that were taken at the time that the malting operations were an integral part of most breweries. This picture of the Octavia Van Dyke Brewery in Green Bay, Wisconsin probably dates to the early 1890s. And we can see the employees of the malt house proudly holding their shovels up in the back. And many of the breweries would have similar pictures. And sometimes we got a pretty good idea of who did what by the tools they were holding. And brewers large and small did their own malting. Gottfried Kuntz was a brewer and malter in Branch, Wisconsin, which was a very small village outside of Manitowoc. So it didn't matter how big or how small you were, it was more whether or not if you had the skill and the interest in being a center of community agribusiness. The brewers had an incentive to make sure they were getting the very best malting barley. And I found several occasions in which they, even back in the 1820s, they were giving prizes for the best barley. So this again is Abbott in Detroit, and they're offering a $20 prize in addition to the price for the barley for the best 100 bushels of barley raised in Michigan, which at that time was also still a territory. Some of you may have noticed up in the upper paragraph that he wants 4,000 bushels of barley, for which 4 shillings will be given for every bushel weighing 50 pounds. Shillings, at that point, the shilling coin was the same size as the United States quarter, so that terminology was still sometimes being used. So it kind of an interesting historical artifact there. I have found these contests elsewhere. We have one from Massachusetts, we have one from Connecticut, and both of these were offering it, either you could get the cash premium or a silver cup. So you could have the trophy to put up on your mantelpiece. One of the things that I liked about this particular ad was, in addition to the fact that the Shiley and Knepper were running a malt house in Davenport, Iowa, they malted, they sold malt to other people, they sold hops to other people. They apparently were the ultimate in homebrew stores, because you could buy your malt, your hops, your pitch, rosin, bongs, corks, all of these brewing essentials from this particular brewery. So I need to do more research and find out to what extent they were supplying other breweries, or whether home brewing on a sizable scale was still going on in Iowa at this time. Many of the malt houses got to be fairly elaborate productions. So the Philip Best Brewing Company, this at their Southside Brewery, had its own malt house, which was located closer to the river, though no near as close to the river as this picture would seem to indicate. It was mostly put down there so they could put in an image of Fred Pabst's old steamboat, the Comet, that he used to captain when he was on Lake Michigan. So a lot of these pictorials we have come to distrust, because the scale was changed a lot in order to make the buildings look more impressive or their location to look more convenient. So one of the other things that I mentioned in passing earlier was the sale or delivery of spent grains. And in addition to the big testimonial for how wonderful the farmer's brewery was, at the bottom, we can tell where roughly when the brew dates would be, because you could go pick up your grains at the brewery on Mondays, Wednesdays, or Fridays in the afternoon. So presumably they had gotten their mash all done and gotten the boil and scraped out the brew kettle by afternoon on those 3 days. And in addition, of course, they still want to buy barley for cash. And in this particular case, we have found some additional information. This is from Jackson, Michigan. It's somewhat later, it's the 1860s. But this is one of the few times I've actually seen a price given for the malt. Excuse me, just a second. Casper Hanley, and his name is really misspelled there, was not only telling people how wonderful that the spent grains were as cattle feed, he priced it at 8 cents a bushel. And I haven't seen that price anywhere else until just finding this one. And he is also selling the grains to households, though it's likely that it's the yeast that they're probably selling more to the housekeepers than the fresh grains. But at this point also, many private families would still have some livestock out in the backyard, so they may also have wanted some grains, in particular if they were keeping pigs. So there were a couple of different ways of getting your grain, and this particular one is a photo of the son of one of the farmers in Minneapolis driving the wagon up to the Minneapolis Brewing Company Grain Belt Brewery on Marshall Avenue. And the structure still exists today, and this part of the building is instantly recognizable on the front of the building. The farm that was picking up this grain was also located about a mile from where I live right now. So this one is kind of a fun picture for me. And we can see that they are getting wet grains because they're still steaming in the bed of the cart. And sometimes you would also have companies that were specifically devoted to this, like the Milwaukee Grain and Feed Company, that would turn this into a specialty business. One other quick point about this, going into the brewery to pick up the grains was one of the standard parts of many farmers' jobs. And there's an account I have from one case in Milwaukee where one of the farmers left his horse to go conduct some other business in town. And when he got back, the horse had just continued to progress up in its line towards the brewery, and everything was still fine. You know, the horse seemed to just know what to do. And they made some jokes about, well, what had happened if the cart had been filled before the farmer got back. And they speculated the horse probably knew how to take care of the payments plan as well. Of course, as everything becomes even more of a business, it ends up becoming a packaged business, a much more consistent product. And in the case of Miller, they began to dry the grains. This is an advertisement from 1952, but they had been doing it well before that. And so they pointed out here in this ad that they bought more than 150 million pounds of agricultural products. Now that probably includes hops as well, but still most of it is going to be grain. And remember, in the 1950s, Miller was not the giant that it is today. It was still only fourth among the Milwaukee brewers. So if they're buying 150 million pounds worth, Schlitz and Blatz and Pabst must have been purchasing substantially more. So as the business becomes more professional, it starts to take on its own structure. And a lot of this begins really after the Civil War. And this is where we start to see the transition away from brewers dealing directly with farmers and dealing more with specialty malt houses and other businesses. So a lot of this comes through the professional journals of the time. And we see that the first ad on the front page of the Western Brewer Journal is for Pettit and Company, Kenosha Malt House. The other two ads on the front page were also maltings. So we're beginning to see the shift away from the breweries that did everything to breweries that specialized in beer and maltings that specialized in hops. Some of this was part of the general scientific precision that was building in the brewing industry throughout the post-Civil War period. The American brewers' schools were getting established, and the one here in Milwaukee with the Handke School had this great cutaway of their school showing all of the different departments. And the one in the upper middle that I particularly would love to time travel and go back to is their library. But that aside, they had the malting department and packaging and all of the other things that were represented there. And the breweries were really trying to present beer as a product of science starting in this period rather than so much a product of craft. Schlitz was advertising not just that they get the best hops and the best water, but they filtered their air, something which is, all too important right now. And they would show off the science and the industry through brewery tours. And in this particular souvenir guide of the Pabst Brewing Company, your eyes are drawn to the kegging operations and the bottling, because at this point you had to keg it and then bottle it. But there are some tourists walking along the catwalk over to the left there. This was also the era in which belching smokestacks were considered a good thing. This was not air pollution. This was proof that people were being employed and products were being made and money was being made. So the idea that a big brewery was a guarantee of quality really starts in the 1860s or 70s, and of course continues through the 1980s, where the great brewing plants of North America and Europe as well were, not necessarily always the most attractive buildings on the skyline, but very important ones. The excellence could be measured in awards that you would win when exhibiting at various international expositions. And sometimes you would also have your grain and hops there as well. Sometimes breweries would be in the agricultural hall. Sometimes they'd be in the industrial hall, depending on what the organizers were focusing on. So your medal, like this earned by the John Gund Brewing Company in Paris in 1900, was proof that you had mastered the science. And here we see the same medal on their advertising. This is, by the way, the same medal, same year, same exposition that is featured on the Campbell's soup cans, because they also won their medal in Paris in 1900. Science, of course, extends to malting, and we can see on the front cover when Fredert decided they wanted to advertise on the front cover of the directory, they showed the lab rather than a big pile of grain or their silos. But of course, the maltings, like the breweries, were going to be among the most imposing elements of any particular skyline. This is Manitowoc in the 1890s, and the two most prominent buildings back and to the left are the brewery and the malt house of William Rahr's sons. And of course, that will be the company that will develop into Rahr Malting. And clearly this picture is being taken from another grain elevator of equal height, but it still shows the importance of the grain business to many cities, especially those on the Great Lakes. And a little bit of the letterhead, they were also roasting malt for coffee substitute, which apparently had a brief vogue as a favorite in Paris during the late 1890s and early 1900s. The various malting companies, of course, emphasize complete control of operation, once again emphasizing the science, though Laddish have certainly got a nice big picture of their plant there as well. Some of the breweries decided that malting was actually going to be a more productive business than brewing. And that was the case for RAR, which switched away from brewing. Part of the reason for that was the three Manitowoc breweries combined during World War I, and in order to share operations and conserve on energy and ingredients. And at that point, RAR took the malting, a couple of the other ones continued brewing, so that ended up being a permanent shift for them. Kurth and Columbus, Wisconsin, decided to also shift to malting, though they kept their Columbus brewery open until the late 1940s, but they moved their headquarters to Milwaukee. And I bring them up in particular because one of my collector friends had this amazing can of a malt sample from Kurth that we believe is probably from sometime in the 1940s, looking at the lettering. In some cases, we even start to get advertisements about what type of malt is being used. And going back again to the 1870s and Western Brewer, we see that some firms are emphasizing that they are bringing in Canadian barley. There were some others that I don't have advertisements for that were taking care of California barley. And one of the most important features of almost all of these brewing industry journals were the crop reports, and they would have region by region accounts of how the crop was doing and how the prices were in the barley markets. In the 1930s, after repeal, RAR decided that it was important to remind farmers that you couldn't grow just any barley, that if you wanted to use it for brewing rather than just feed, you should probably grow Oderbrucker. Wisconsin 38 was also mentioned in some other publications of the time. The importance of grain showed up in the 1870s, and what would be kind of an interesting preview of some of the ingredient wars that we see today. There was a expose in one of the Milwaukee newspapers about brewers using various adulterants in their products. And this was primarily referring to corn and rice as opposed to chemical adulterants. And there was a big analysis. Somebody got access to the brewers' grain books and found out that Blatz and Pabst in particular were using rice and corn to lighten the brew. Val Blatz in particular said that's what the customers want. We never claimed this was an all malt beer, and rice is even more expensive sometimes, so we don't really consider it an adulterant. The one Milwaukee brewery of any size that was recognized for being all malt all the time was the Franz Falk Brewery. This will eventually combine into Falk, Jung, and Borchert, and then it will also be absorbed into the Pabst company after a couple of major fires. So Falk was generally recognized as the premier Milwaukee beer for the people who were the real connoisseurs of the era. The next label always baffled me when I first saw it, because it doesn't seem like advertising on your lager beer that you've got 67% barley malt is necessarily the way you'd want to go. It seems like that would be a strike against you rather than a recommendation. But I have seen this same label for companies other than the Montgomery Brewing Company in Minnesota. It seemed like a lot of the attention paid to grain and to malt in beer for many, many years was really kind of synonymous with color. We get very little actual advertising about what particular grains were in a beer. At one point, Pabst had a brand called Kaiser, which appears to have been a draft-only product, for which they specifically advertised that they used Montana barley. But I've seen very few other things similar to that where the particular type of grain used was an advertising point. It seems like it was mostly just a matter of color. And the Blatz lineup here from 1899, it would be fascinating to go back in time and have a flight of these beers and see if they are like what we would expect a Wiener beer to taste like today, or what we would expect a Munich Dunkel to taste like today. So the other thing that's briefly noteworthy about this, though not grain related, they make a special emphasis of pointing out that you should make sure that Blatz is on the cork. This is because in the period between the Civil War and World War I, there was a fair market in beer counterfeiting, where unscrupulous operators would buy or steal a bunch of name brand bottles, buy kegs of a local cheap beer, fill the bottles with the local cheap beer and pass them off as the genuine article. So by having branded corks, you could make sure that you were getting what you paid for. Eventually, the crown cap will be a much better solution to that. One or two notes just about other grains. Pre-Prohibition, there really wasn't much else being used that you would advertise except for wheat beer. And I included this label because it was apparently created by the Hankey Brewers School as part of their school project, that you will brew a wheat beer as a team as part of your class activity. But there were some other wheat beers that would show up occasionally, and the Gutsch Brewery of Sheboygan brought out a Kottbusser for several years around 1910. And this is one of those styles which apparently was lost, but 10 years ago or so, there were some craft brewers that started to return to this East German style of wheat beer rather than, say, the Berliner Weiss or the Bavarian wheat beer. None of these styles did much after Prohibition returned. The Fischbach Brewing Company had seen how popular Weiss beer was before Prohibition and decided that they were going to make this their premier flagship brand after Prohibition, and the brewery lasted for about a year because nobody was interested in the type of wheat beer anymore. It was primarily a taste for lager. One of the big problems in marketing grain in beer as an important ingredient, other than just something that will wave beautifully in the TV commercial, was in general, flavor became less of a selling point for beer, really starting at about World War II. And so this is why we get ads like this, where we have hops in it, but just the kiss of the hops. We would not want to have a particularly hoppy beer because it might offend some palates. And we start seeing discussions of how fine the ingredients are, but most of the time, it's not because they add a particular character to the beer. It's because they want to make sure that they're using fine ingredients so they can justify the higher price. Often in this time period, beer is being advertised as refreshing. So while I'm using Kingsbury here, Hamm's was just as famous for their famous water-based ads for Olympia. The entire slogan was "It's the water." Numerous breweries used waterfalls, whether they were near one or not. So beer was advertised as being refreshing. And not only that, beer was advertised as being convenient. And is Schlitz a good beer? Who cares? It comes in half-quart cans. So in addition to being an absolutely wonderful illustration of mid-1950s fashion. So luckily, in the craft beer era, we've begun to turn the corner from this, and grain, as well as hops, though I would contend to a lesser degree than hops so far, has become something important again to talk about, because we're not trying to compete for basic American lager, where we're competing on price, refreshment, and the bright movement and color in the ads. We can start looking at different types of beer and how a particular grain would emphasize them. So this is the Milwaukee Brewing Company, Milwaukee Brewing Company's list. We took this picture in about 2011. So if they have continued to actually just add to this list, it's probably hanging down near to the floor by this point. So some breweries are doing smash beers, single malt and single hop beers, where they're isolating a particular grain, whether it's a local one or whether it's one of the classic ones like Maris Otter or Golden Promise that they've brought in from the old country. Or we're seeing, even in canned beers, a huge variety of different styles available now that craft canning has been considerably cheaper. We're seeing a number of breweries, especially in Wisconsin, who are trying to use all Wisconsin ingredients in a particular beer. So, we've gotten around the corner here to where the ingredients of beer are really important again. And so there's just an amazing number of really good beers out there. So what'll you have? So that ends the official